At dawn on October 25, 1944, the Pacific was quiet in a way that felt almost unnatural. A flat gray horizon stretching endlessly as light crept over the water near the Philippine island of Samar, and aboard a small group of American escort carriers and destroyers known as Task Unit 77.4-3, later remembered simply as Taffy 3. Sailors went about their morning routines, believing the greatest danger lay hundreds of miles away, because intelligence reports insisted the Japanese center force had been broken and driven back the previous day, and the men of Taffy 3, flying small escort carriers with thin decks and slow aircraft, were assigned what seemed like a secondary mission, providing air support for troops landing at Leyte, not preparing to face the main battle fleet of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Yet as the sun rose higher, shapes appeared on the horizon that did not belong to friendly forces, dark silhouettes resolving into towering pagoda masts and long gun barrels. And within minutes the truth became horrifyingly clear. The Japanese center force under Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita had not retreated at all. It had passed through San Bernardino Strait during the night, and now bore down directly on the weakest American naval unit in the area, a force built around escort carriers and protected by only 3 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts. While racing toward them were some of the most powerful warships ever built, including battleships like Yamato with guns capable of firing shells weighing more than a ton, heavy cruisers, light cruisers, and destroyers moving at high speed, their presence shattering every assumption the Americans had made about the battle's direction. Confusion spread instantly across the decks of Taffy 3 as range estimates came in and binoculars confirmed the impossible. Battleships, not distant, not retreating, but closing fast. And at that moment, the balance of power was so lopsided that survival itself seemed mathematically impossible. Because escort carriers were never designed to face surface combatants. Their aircraft were loaded with bombs meant for land targets or depth charges for submarines, and their thin hulls could be ripped apart by a single heavy shell, while the destroyers, Johnston, Hoel, and Heermann, were small fast ships with limited armor, armed with torpedoes and 5-inch guns, courageous vessels but utterly outmatched in any conventional engagement. Yet war does not always obey logic, and as the shot gave way to action, orders crackled across radios, smoke screens were laid, aircraft were launched regardless of their armament, and the destroyers were ordered to attack, not because anyone believed they could win, but because there was no other option. Because if Kurita's fleet broke through, the invasion forces at Leyte would be slaughtered, transports and supply ships destroyed, and the entire campaign thrown into chaos. So the destroyers turned toward the enemy, accelerating into a storm of steel that should have annihilated them within minutes. The first of these was USS Johnston, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Ernest E. Evans, a man known for his aggressiveness and his unshakable sense of duty, who did not hesitate when the order came, pushing his ship to flank speed and charging directly at the Japanese line, laying a thick smoke screen to obscure the escort carriers behind him, and as Johnston closed the distance, the sea erupted around her, massive geysers thrown up by shells from Japanese cruisers and battleships, each splash a reminder of how small and fragile the American destroyer truly was. But Evans pressed on, maneuvering violently, firing his 5-inch guns as fast as they could be loaded, targeting cruisers far larger than his own ship, and then launching torpedoes at close range, a move that forced the Japanese to turn away, temporarily to avoid the deadly spreads, buying precious minutes for the carriers to escape eastward. In the air above, American pilots launched from the escort carriers with whatever weapons they had, some carrying only machine guns, others with half-loaded bomb racks, flying directly into anti-aircraft fire to harass the Japanese formation. Strafing decks, dropping depth charges on battleships, anything to create confusion and slow the advance, and remarkably, it worked, because Kurita's force, already shaken by losses the previous day and uncertain about the overall situation, suddenly faced an aggressive defense that did not match the weak force he expected to find. Meanwhile, USS Hoel and USS Heermann followed Johnston's example, charging into the enemy, weaving through shellfire, launching torpedoes, and drawing attention away from the carriers, and one by one they were hit, Hoel taking heavy damage. That would eventually doom her. Johnston struck repeatedly by large caliber shells that tore through her hull, knocked out engines, and caused terrible casualties. Yet even as Johnston slowed and lost power, her guns continued to fire. Crews, manually loading shells, refusing to abandon their posts while Japanese ships closed in from all sides. The Japanese gunners, firing from distances that would normally guarantee hits, found their targets masked by smoke and rain squalls, their shells often overshooting or falling short as the destroyers zigzagged at full speed, and in the chaos, Kurita struggled to assess what he was facing, misidentifying the escort carriers as fleet carriers, and believing he had stumbled upon a much larger American force. A fatal misjudgment that caused him to hesitate and maneuver defensively at the fatal misjudgment that caused him to hesitate and maneuver defensively at the very moment he should have pressed his overwhelming advantage. As the battle raged, the sea became a churning battlefield of smoke, splashes, burning oil, and falling aircraft. And through it all the destroyers continued to fight far beyond any reasonable expectation. Not because they thought they could win, but because every second mattered, every torpedo spread that forced a turn, every burst of gunfire that damaged a cruiser or killed a gun crew, bought time for the vulnerable carriers to run, and that time translated directly into lives saved and a landing force preserved. Johnston, battered and slowing, was eventually surrounded, her decks littered with wounded, her superstructure shattered, but her crew still fought, firing until ammunition ran low and the ship could no longer maneuver, and when Evans was wounded and command passed to others, the resolve of the crew did not falter, a testament to the discipline and spirit forged through training and shared purpose. Around them, Hoel was sinking after absorbing punishment that would have destroyed much larger ships, and Heermann, though damaged, continued to make attack runs, firing torpedoes that struck Japanese cruisers and forced battleships to maneuver, contributing to the growing sense within the Japanese command that they were facing a determined and possibly larger opponent than anticipated. The escort carriers themselves were not passive victims, turning away at full speed, launching aircraft continuously, their decks damaged by near misses and strafing runs, but still operating, still sending pilots into the fray. And as the morning wore on, the cumulative effect of this resistance began to tell. Japanese cruisers were damaged or sunk, destroyers were scattered, and Kurita's formation lost cohesion, while reports of American air attacks from other directions added to the confusion, creating the impression that the entire U.S. Third Fleet might be converging on him. By mid-morning, the impossible had begun to happen. The Japanese advance slowed, then wavered, and finally, in a decision that would be debated for decades, Kurita ordered a withdrawal, turning his powerful fleet away from the defenseless transports. At Leyte, retreating back towards San Bernardino Strait, leaving behind a scene that defied all conventional logic of naval warfare, where 3 destroyers and a handful of escort carriers had faced down a battle fleet and lived to tell the story, though at terrible cost. The sea around Samar was littered with wreckage and oil slicks, survivors clinging to rafts, wounded ships limping away, and the destroyers that had charged into history were gone or crippled. Johnston and Hoel lost with most of their crews. Their sacrifice etched permanently into the memory of the battle, because their actions were not just acts of bravery, but decisive moments that changed the course of the Leyte Gulf campaign, preserving the invasion and hastening the collapse of Japanese resistance in the Philippines. This was the Samar miracle, not a miracle of luck alone, but of human will, of commanders who chose action over surrender, of crews who stood their ground against impossible odds, and of a battle where courage and confusion combined to overturn the expectations of both sides, setting the stage for the final unraveling of Japan's naval power in the Pacific. And this was only the beginning of a story whose echoes would be felt long after the guns fell silent. As the smoke thinned and the Japanese fleet turned away, the men of Taffy 3 did not immediately realize that the battle had truly ended, because for hours they had lived inside a collapsing world where every second brought new explosions and fresh threats, and even as Kurita's ships withdrew, shells still fell, aircraft still burned in the sky, and damaged American vessels struggled simply to remain afloat. Yet slowly, painfully, the truth emerged that the impossible had happened, that the most powerful surface fleet Japan could assemble had been driven off by a force it should have. Crushed without mercy, and this realization came not with celebration, but with exhaustion and grief, because the cost had been terrible, and the sea around Samar was now a graveyard. Survivors from Johnston and Hoel floated among debris and oil, many wounded, some burned, others clinging to wreckage for hours under the tropical sun, uncertain if rescue would come, while Japanese ships, having withdrawn, left them behind. And American escorts, once the threat had fully passed, began the slow, dangerous work of picking up survivors, knowing that every man pulled from the water represented a story of endurance that defied belief. On the surviving escort carriers, damage control parties worked relentlessly, fighting fires, shoring up bulkheads, clearing wreckage from flight decks, because although they had escaped destruction, they were far from unharmed, and the psychological impact of having faced battleships at close range lingered heavily, with sailors replaying moments of terror and disbelief in their minds, asking themselves how they had lived when so many others had not. Above them, aircraft continued to fly, some returning with empty fuel tanks and riddled wings, pilots landing on damaged decks with barely enough control to survive, and when they shut down their engines, the adrenaline faded, leaving only shaking hands in the realization that they had attacked battleships with machine guns and depth charges, acts that in any rational analysis bordered on the absurd. Yet those attacks had mattered, each one contributing to the illusion of strength and aggression that ultimately convinced Kurita he was facing something far greater than reality. In the aftermath, reports filtered in slowly, pieced together from fragmented radio messages and survivor accounts, revealing the full scope of the Japanese withdrawal. And as American commanders began to understand what had been achieved, astonishment spread through the fleet, because no doctrine, no war game, no pre-war planning had ever suggested that escort carriers and destroyers could repel a battle fleet. And yet that was precisely what had occurred, forcing historians and naval officers alike to confront the unpredictable nature of combat when human decision, fear, and courage intersect. For the Japanese, the battle was equally confusing and deeply troubling, because Kurita's decision to withdraw was shaped by more than just the immediate tactical situation. It was influenced by the cumulative strain of years of war, the losses suffered the previous day in the Sibuyan Sea, the absence of air cover, and the constant expectation of American carrier attacks. And when his ships encountered fierce resistance at Samar, it confirmed his worst fears that he had sailed into a trap. And even as his guns outranged and outmatched anything the Americans could bring against him, the uncertainty of the broader strategic picture weighed heavily, leading him to choose preservation over annihilation, a choice that would later be criticized, but was entirely human in the moment. Back on the American side, news of the destroyer's actions spread rapidly, and the names Johnston, Hoel, and Heermann became symbols of defiance, their commanders and crews praised for charging into overwhelming fire without hesitation, and among them, Ernest Evans of Johnston stood out, a commander who had understood that his ship was expendable if its sacrifice could save the carriers and the invasion force, a calculation that no officer makes lightly, yet one that he accepted, fully embodying a leadership ideal that would be studied long after the war. As the survivors were brought aboard rescue ships, their condition testified to the intensity of the fight. Men burned by explosions, wounded by shrapnel, exhausted from hours in the water, and yet many spoke not of fear, but of anger and determination, of refusing to let the enemy pass, of doing what had to be done because there was no alternative. And this mindset, forged under pressure, was a crucial element of the Samar miracle, because it transformed a desperate defense into an aggressive stand that shocked the enemy. In the days that followed, the broader Battle of Leyte Gulf came into clearer focus, revealing that Samar was only one part of a massive, multi-day struggle that marked the effective end of Japan's ability to conduct large-scale naval operations. And yet within that immense battle, Samar stood apart, not for the number of ships involved, but for the disparity of forces and the consequences of a few critical decisions made under fire. American analysts would later note that had Kurita pressed forward for even another hour, the outcome might have been catastrophic for the invasion fleet. But war is not fought in hindsight, it is fought in moments of incomplete information. And in those moments, the aggressive defense by Taffy III created a reality that Kurita could not ignore, forcing him to choose caution where boldness might have changed history. For the families of those lost, the Samar miracle was a bittersweet phrase, because miracles do not erase grief, and the letters sent home carried both pride and sorrow. Official notifications speaking of bravery and sacrifice, while offering little comfort for the absence left behind. And yet within the Navy, the legacy of Samar became a powerful teaching tool, a reminder that initiative, courage, and the willingness to act decisively can offset even the most unfavorable odds. Lessons that would shape post-war doctrine and leadership training. The ships themselves, or what remained of them, became part of the story, Heermann surviving despite damage, her hull scarred by near misses, her crew forever bound by what they had faced together, while the lost destroyers were honored through memorials and citations, their actions formally recognized as among the most extraordinary in naval history. And as years passed, survivors would gather, recounting the battle not with exaggeration, but with quiet intensity, because the truth required no embellishment. Historians examining Japanese records later confirmed how close the battle had come to a different outcome, revealing confusion within Kurita's staff, misidentifications of American ships, overestimates of carrier strength, and the psychological impact of continuous air attacks, however light their physical damage, showing that perception can be as decisive as firepower, and that in naval warfare, especially in an age transitioning from battleships to aircraft carriers, uncertainty could paralyze even the strongest fleet. The Samar miracle thus became a case study in asymmetric defense, where smaller, weaker forces exploit speed, aggression, and surprise to disrupt a superior enemy, not by destroying it outright, but by denying it freedom of action, and in doing so altering the strategic outcome of an entire campaign. For the men who lived through it, however, these analyses came much later, because in the immediate aftermath, their world was reduced to survival, to tending the wounded, to mourning the dead, and to absorbing the shock of having stared directly into the guns of battleships and lived an experience that left an indelible mark on every survivor. Even years later, many would say that the most vivid memory was not the sound of the guns, but the sight of those towering Japanese ships emerging from the mist at dawn, a moment when the rules of war seemed to collapse, and all that remained was the choice to fight or flee. And in that moment, the destroyers of Taffy III chose to fight, setting in motion a chain of events that would echo far beyond the waters off Samar, shaping the final chapters of the Pacific War and securing their place in history as the small ships that stood against a battle fleet and refused to yield. Long after the guns fell silent off Samar, the meaning of what had happened continued to unfold in ways that none of the men involved could have fully understood on that morning in October 1944, because the battle was not just a dramatic episode. Of courage, it was a turning point that revealed how the nature of naval warfare had irrevocably changed, and how human resolve could bend even the most carefully constructed battle plans into something unrecognizable. In the days following the engagement, American forces consolidated their hold on Leyte, unloading troops, vehicles, and supplies without interference from Japanese surface ships, and every safe landing was a direct consequence of the hours bought by the destroyers and escort carriers of Taffy III, whose sacrifice created a protective gap between Kurita's guns and the vulnerable invasion fleet. For the Japanese Navy, the withdrawal from Samar marked more than a missed opportunity. It symbolized the final collapse of the doctrine that had guided it for decades, the belief that decisive surface battles between battleships would determine the outcome of wars at sea, because at Samar, the largest battleship ever built had been turned away by aircraft without bombs, destroyers firing their last torpedoes, and a haze of smoke that hid ships too small to matter on paper, but too determined to ignore in reality. As Kurita's fleet retreated through San Bernardino Strait, it did so under the shadow of this realization that even overwhelming firepower could be rendered useless by confusion, fear of unseen threats, and the aggressive will of an opponent who refused to behave as expected. And this realization lingered as Japanese commanders reviewed the battle, searching for explanations that could reconcile their strength with their failure. Within the United States Navy, Samar became both a source of pride and a sobering lesson, because it demonstrated that while technology and numbers mattered, they could never replace leadership, initiative, and the willingness to act decisively under extreme pressure, qualities that had been displayed in abundance by officers and enlisted men alike, many of whom had never expected to face surface combat at all. Training manuals and war colleges would later dissect the battle, analyzing how smokescreens, independent action by destroyer commanders, and relentless air harassment combined to create a tactical illusion that paralyzed a superior enemy, and yet no analysis could fully capture the emotional reality faced by those on the decks of Johnston, Hoel, and Heermann, where every order was given with the knowledge that it might be the last. The men who survived carried those moments with them for the rest of their lives, often struggling to explain how it felt to charge toward battleships knowing that retreat might offer a chance to live, but choosing instead to advance because others depended on them, and for many, this choice became a defining moment, shaping their understanding of duty, sacrifice, and the fragile line between survival and loss. Families at home learned of the battle through official communiques and newspaper headlines that spoke of heroism and victory. But behind those words lay a more complex truth, one of grief mingled with pride, of sons and husbands lost in a battle few civilians could fully comprehend, and for them, the Samar miracle was not an abstract historical event, but a deeply personal story etched into letters, photographs, and memories that would be passed down through generations. As time passed and the war moved toward its conclusion, the legacy of Samar grew rather than faded, because it stood as a reminder that even in an era dominated by massive industrial power and mechanized warfare, individual actions still mattered profoundly, and that a handful of ships, properly led and fiercely defended, could alter the course of a campaign against all expectations. Japanese veterans who survived the war would later reflect on the encounter with a sense of disbelief, recalling how they had expected an easy victory over what they believed were lightly defended carriers, only to be met with a ferocity that suggested desperation and strength far beyond the reality. And some would admit that the aggressiveness of the American defense convinced them they were facing fleet carriers backed by powerful escorts, a misjudgment that revealed how perception could override intelligence and firepower alike. The sinking of cruisers and the damage inflicted during the battle further reinforced this impression, creating a psychological weight that no single report or observation could dispel in the heat of combat. And by the time clarity might have emerged, the moment for decisive action had already passed. In the broader sweep of history, The Battle off Samar came to represent the climax of the Battle of Leyte Gulf, itself the largest naval battle ever fought, and within that immense confrontation, Samar stood out as the most improbable and emotionally charged episode, a David and Goliath struggle where the smaller force did not merely survive, but achieved its strategic purpose through audacity alone. Naval historians would later argue that Samar marked the effective end of the battleship as the dominant instrument of sea power, because despite their immense guns and armor, battleships proved unable to impose their will without air superiority and clear situational awareness, both of which had been denied to Kurita by circumstances and by the actions of Taffy III. The destroyers, often regarded as expendable escorts, emerged from the narrative as decisive actors, their speed, flexibility, and aggressive employment demonstrating a versatility that larger ships could not match. And this reevaluation would influence naval design and doctrine in the post-war world. Memorials and commemorations ensured that the names of the ships and their crews would not be forgotten, with Johnston, Hoel, and the others honored not just for their sacrifice, but for the example they set, an example that transcended nationality and era, speaking to a universal truth about courage under fire. Survivors who gathered at reunions spoke quietly about the battle, often focusing on small details, the sound of shells passing overhead, the smell of burning paint, the sudden silence after an explosion, because these fragments captured the reality of combat more accurately than any grand narrative, and through these stories, the human dimension of Samar remained alive. As decades passed and the world changed, the battle's relevance did not diminish, because its lessons extended beyond naval warfare, illustrating how unexpected resistance can disrupt even the most powerful forces, how leadership can inspire ordinary individuals to extraordinary action, and how uncertainty can be as decisive as strength in determining outcomes. For modern audiences, the Samar miracle serves as a reminder that history is not shaped solely by grand strategies and overwhelming power, but by moments when individuals are forced to choose between fear and duty, and choose duty despite the cost. In the end, the waters off Samar returned to calm, the wreckage settled into silence, and the war moved on, but the story of 3 destroyers standing against a battle fleet endured, carried forward by those who remembered, studied, and honored, in ensuring that the courage displayed that morning would not be lost to time. It remains a testament to the idea that even in the darkest hours, when defeat seems inevitable and the enemy appears unstoppable, resolve and sacrifice can create outcomes that defy logic and in doing so, shape the course of history itself.